The cold came without warning that night. It swept through the stone corridors of Castle Velmore like a living thing, curling beneath door frames and swallowing the warmth of every torch it passed. Rose pulled her worn wool shawl tighter across her shoulders and kept her eyes low, the way she had learned to do in the 3 years she had served within these walls. Eyes low, steps quiet, presence forgettable. That was the only way to survive in a house that belonged to someone else. She carried a brass tray stacked with empty goblets from the eastern hall, her boots whispering against the cold flagstone floor. The hour was late, well past the time when maids of her rank were permitted to walk the upper corridors. But the feast had run long, and the steward had sent her to collect what remained before morning. There was no arguing with the steward. There never was. The scent of burnt candle wax and spilled wine hung thick in the air as she moved past the great arched doorway of the war room. She did not look inside. She had learned long ago not to look into rooms where powerful men gathered, because what the eyes saw, the tongue could not always keep to itself, and loose tongues in Velmore had a way of disappearing. But she heard the voice, clear, low, deliberate. The border territories will be signed over by dawn. Oswin has confirmed it. Rose slowed her steps without meaning to. She recognized that voice. It belonged to Cale, Beta of Velmore, second only to the Alpha King himself, a man with sharp eyes the color of flint and a smile that never quite reached them. She had served his table many times. She had learned to read the difference between a man's public warmth and his private coldness, and Cale wore both with practiced ease. And the northern clans have agreed to the terms? A second voice, deeper, rougher, carrying the particular weight of a man who did not need to raise it to be obeyed. Rose's grip tightened on the tray. That was the Alpha King, Draven of Velmore. She had seen him only from a distance, the way most servants did. A tall silhouette at the head of a table, broad shoulders beneath a dark fur mantle. A face that looked as though it had been carved from something harder than patience. He had ruled for 7 years following his father's death, and in those 7 years, Velmore had known neither famine nor invasion, which was more than most territories could claim. The servants spoke of him the way people spoke of winter, with respect, a little fear, and the clear understanding that softness was not part of his nature. They have, Cale said smoothly. Every clan representative signed the agreement this afternoon. The border will be yours by sunrise. A pause. Good. Rose began moving again, and then stopped. Because she had been in the eastern hall that afternoon, clearing linens from the side chamber where the clan representatives had gathered. She had seen the documents on the table. She had seen the signatures. Or rather, she had seen the 2 blank lines where signatures should have been, still empty when the steward had rushed her out before the meeting concluded. 2 clans had not signed. She knew what she had seen. Her memory was one of the few things in her life that had never failed her. Her pulse quickened against her ribs. She stood there in the corridor, the tray cold and heavy in her hands, caught between 2 instincts she had long learned to distrust, the instinct to speak and the instinct to stay invisible. The war room door was not fully closed. Through the narrow gap, she could see the edge of the long oak table, the scattered maps and wax-sealed documents, the low orange glow of the fire, and, barely at the far end, the back of a broad figure seated in a heavy chair. Cale stood facing him, and even from this angle, from this distance, Rose could see the particular stillness in the Beta's posture. Not the stillness of a man at ease, the stillness of a man who was performing ease. She had seen that stillness before. In the market, on the face of a merchant who was counting wrong on purpose. In the kitchen, on a cook who swore the pantry had never been opened. She knew the specific quality of a lie held carefully in place, the way a person's body went just slightly too calm when the words leaving their mouth were not the ones living in their chest. There is one other matter, Cale said, his tone shifting by a fraction. The Northern delegation has requested a private audience before the formal signing ceremony. I recommend you decline. It would appear as weakness. Another pause. Longer this time. Why? They are testing boundaries, my king. It is a known tactic. Send them my answer in the morning. Of course. Rose should have walked away. She told herself that very clearly, the words forming in her mind with the precision of someone who had given herself this instruction before. Walk away. It is not your concern. You are a maid. You carry goblets. You keep your eyes low. She took one step. Then the tray slipped. Not far. Just enough. One goblet slid, struck another, and the soft metallic ring of brass on brass rang out in the quiet corridor like a small, terrible bell. The war room door swung open. Cale stood in the frame, and the look on his face when he saw her, just for a fraction of a second before his expression smoothed itself back into something neutral, was not surprise. It was recognition, as though he had on some level been waiting for exactly this kind of inconvenience to appear. You. His voice was pleasant. That was always the most frightening thing about Cale. How pleasant he could make his voice sound. What are you doing in this corridor at this hour? Rose's mouth went dry. The steward sent me to collect the goblets from the Eastern Hall, my lord. She kept her gaze down. I did not mean to disturb. The Eastern Hall is in the opposite direction. I took the wrong passage. I apologize. A long moment stretched between them, filled with the distant sound of wind pressing against stone and the quiet hiss of a torch guttering somewhere down the hall. Go, Cale said simply. And Rose went. She walked quickly, not quickly enough to seem like she was running, because running told people something was wrong, and something was very wrong, and she needed to reach the servant's stair before the shaking in her hands reached her legs. The tray rattled softly with each step. She turned 2 corners, descended a half flight of stairs, and pressed herself into the narrow alcove beside the linen storage room, back flat against the cold stone, breath coming in short, careful pulls. 2 signatures missing. Cale had told the Alpha King that every clan had agreed. She closed her eyes and saw the table again clearly. The long document, the column of names, the empty lines at the bottom. She was not mistaken. She had stood 2 feet from that table for nearly a full minute while she gathered the linens, and she had a habit, born from years of boredom and sharp attention, of reading whatever was in front of her. The Westmark clan had not signed, neither had the Stonefield delegation, which meant the border deal was not complete, which meant that whatever the Alpha King agreed to at sunrise would be built on an incomplete foundation, which meant, and this was the part that made her stomach cold, that someone intended for him not to know that. Rose stood in the dark alcove for a long time. She thought about what happened to servants who interfered in the politics of powerful men. She thought about the woman who had worked in the kitchens before her, who had repeated something she overheard and vanished from the castle within a week. She thought about her younger brother in the village below the hill, who depended on the coin she sent home each month to keep their mother fed through winter. She thought about all of this very clearly and very carefully, and then she straightened her shawl, picked up her tray, and turned back toward the upper corridor. Because 2 signatures were missing, and somewhere in that war room, the most powerful man in Velmore was being lied to by the person standing closest to him. And Rose had never been able to convince herself that silence was the same thing as safety. She just hadn't figured out yet how much it was going to cost her. The door to the war room was still slightly open when she returned. She raised her hand and knocked. The knock was quiet. Almost too quiet. Rose stood in the corridor with her tray pressed against her ribs and her knuckles still hovering near the door, already half convinced she had made the worst decision of her life. The wood was cold beneath her hand. The torchlight trembled. From inside the war room came no sound at all for a long moment, and then the door opened fully. and she was no longer looking at Kale. She was looking at the Alpha King. Draven of Velmore was taller than she had understood from a distance. That was the first thing she registered. The sheer fact of his height, the breadth of his shoulders beneath a dark linen shirt, the fur-lined mantle pushed back and half-draped over the arm of his chair as though he had discarded it mid-thought. He had dark hair, slightly disheveled, the kind that suggested he ran his hands through it when he was thinking. His jaw was heavy, his eyes darker than she expected. Not black, but the deep, unremarkable brown of riverstone, the kind that only showed their color when the light hit them directly. Those eyes dropped to her immediately. She felt the weight of his attention the way you felt a change in weather, not dramatic, but undeniable. A shift in pressure, a drop in temperature. Kale stood 3 paces behind him, and the pleasantness had returned to his expression, smooth and patient as lacquered wood. "The maid from the corridor," Kale said, almost gently. "She became lost, my king. I already sent her away." Rose did not look at Kale. She kept her eyes on Draven, which went against every instinct she had built over 3 years of service, every careful habit of deference and invisibility. But she had knocked on this door, and the only thing more dangerous than speaking now would be losing her nerve halfway through. "I need to speak with you," she said. Her voice came out steadier than she felt. "Privately, my king. It concerns the border agreement." The silence that followed was the kind that had texture. She could feel Kale's gaze on the side of her face like a blade held just above the skin. Not touching, but present. Waiting. Draven studied her for a moment that stretched far longer than was comfortable. His expression revealed nothing. Not suspicion, not curiosity, not dismissal. Just that flat, measuring stillness of a man who had learned to evaluate threats quickly and was currently deciding which category she belonged to. "You're a maid," he said. It was not a question. "Yes, my king." "And you have business with the border agreement." "I believe so, my king. Yes." Another silence. Then, without looking away from her, Draven spoke to Kale. "Leave us." The temperature in the corridor seemed to drop by several degrees. "My king," Kale said, his voice still smooth but carrying something new beneath it, the faintest vibration of a string pulled too tight. "She is a servant. Whatever she believes, she knows." "Leave us, Kale." It was not louder than his previous words. It did not need to be. There was a quality to Draven's voice in that moment, a particular finality, like a door closing, that made argument feel not merely unwise but structurally impossible. A pause. Then the sound of boots on stone, retreating down the corridor. A distant door. Silence. Draven stepped back and held the war room door open. Rose walked inside. The room was larger than it looked from the corridor. The long oak table dominated the center, its surface covered in maps weighted at the corners with iron discs, scrolls half unrolled, documents stacked in loose piles. The fire in the hearth was low but still generous, throwing amber light across the stone walls. The smell of the room was specific and layered. Old paper, candle tallow, pine resin from the logs, and beneath all of it the faint, cold scent of the mountains that seemed to live permanently in the stone of Velmore's walls. Draven did not sit. He stood beside the table and looked at her, and the directness of it made her want to step backward, but she held her ground. "Speak," he said. Rose set her tray down on the edge of the table, partly because her arms were trembling slightly, and she did not want him to see it, and partly because she needed both hands free to feel like herself. "I was in the Eastern Hall this afternoon," she began, collecting linens from the side chamber where the clan delegation meeting was held. "And?" "The border agreement was on the table. I saw it clearly. There were 2 signatures missing, the Westmark clan representative and the Stonefield delegation. The lines were blank." Nothing moved in Draven's face. Your beta told you every clan had signed, Rose continued, and she heard the slight unevenness enter her voice now. Not from fear exactly, but from the irreversibility of what she was doing, the way you felt stepping off the edge of something. That is not what I saw. The fire snapped quietly. Outside, the wind pressed against the high, narrow windows. You are telling me, Draven said slowly, that my beta lied to me. I am telling you what I saw, my king. You may verify it yourself. Why would you come to me with this? The question was genuine. She could hear it. Not accusatory, not rhetorical, but honestly curious. The question of a man trying to understand a piece of the situation that did not fit his model of how the world worked. Why would a maid risk everything to knock on the Alpha King's door in the middle of the night? Rose considered her answer for a moment. Because if the agreement is incomplete, and you sign at sunrise, the northern clans who did not consent will have legal ground to contest the border. It could mean conflict. It could mean blood. She paused. People in the territories below the border are not lords and soldiers. They are farmers and their children and people who send coin home to their mothers. They are not equipped for what a contested border brings. Something shifted in Draven's expression. So small she nearly missed it. A slight tightening around the eyes. Not coldness, but something closer to recognition. As though she had said something that connected to a thought he had already been carrying. He moved to the table and lifted one of the stacked documents. He studied it for a long moment, then set it down and lifted another. Rose watched his hands, careful, methodical, the hands of someone who read documents the way other people read faces. He stopped. She saw the moment he found it, the subtle stiffening of his posture, the slight pause in his breathing. He set the document down without slamming it, which somehow made it worse. Controlled anger was always more frightening than open anger. "What is your name?" he asked without looking up. "Rose, my king." "How long have you served in Velmore?" 3 years. "In which capacity?" "General household service. Linens, hall clearing, kitchen support during feast days." He finally looked up. The firelight caught his eyes and she saw the color properly for the first time. Not plain brown, but something richer, with depth, like amber held against flame. "Rose." He said her name as though weighing it. "You understand what you have done tonight?" "I do, my king. You have accused my beta of deliberate deception in a matter of territorial law. If you are wrong, or if this is someone else's manipulation using you as a messenger—" "I am not wrong," she said, "and I am no one's messenger. I saw what I saw." The words landed in the room and stayed there. Draven studied her for another long moment, that measuring, weather-like quality of his attention fully present. And Rose stood beneath it and did not flinch, because she had already passed the point where flinching would help her. "You will remain in the castle tonight," he said finally. "You will not speak of this to anyone. Not the steward, not the other servants, not anyone who asks. Do you understand? Yes. If I find you have fabricated this, you will not find that." Another silence. The fire settled. Somewhere far above them, the wind moved across the castle roof like a held breath finally released. Draven turned back to the documents on the table, and Rose understood she had been dismissed. She picked up her tray and walked to the door. "Rose." She stopped. "You walked back to this door after Kale sent you away," Draven said, still not looking up from the documents. "That took something." She did not answer. There was nothing to answer with that wouldn't sound like she was asking for something in return. She left the war room and walked back down the corridor, and it was only when she reached the servants' stair, only when she was fully alone in the narrow dark of the back passage, that she let herself lean against the wall and breathe. Her hands, she noticed, were shaking badly now. She had not been afraid while she was inside. That seemed important somehow. The fear had waited politely until it was no longer useful, and now it was making up for lost time. Somewhere above her, she heard the sound of boots moving fast across stone. Draven was already moving. Rose did not sleep. She lay on her narrow cot in the servants' quarters, staring at the dark ceiling with her shawl still wrapped around her shoulders, listening to the castle breathe around her. The room she shared with 2 other maids was small and close, smelling of tallow soap and dried lavender that someone had tucked into the window ledge months ago and forgotten. The other women slept soundly on either side of her, their breathing slow and even, unbothered by the particular kind of wakefulness that came from having done something irreversible before midnight. Rose had counted every stone in the ceiling by the time pale gray light began creeping beneath the door. She heard the commotion before she understood it. Voices in the upper corridor, not the usual morning murmur of servants beginning their work, but something sharper, more directional. Boots moving with purpose. A door opening and closing with more force than necessary. She sat up slowly and pressed her ear toward the sound the way she had learned to do, reading the castle the way sailors read water. Something had happened. She dressed quickly, practical wool dress and leather apron, her dark hair twisted and pinned without ceremony. She did not allow herself to think about what Draven had found in those documents, or what he had done with the finding. She had delivered what she knew. The rest belonged to men with more power and more to lose than she had. And she had learned a long time ago that you could not carry other people's storms. But she could not quite make herself believe that this particular storm would pass without touching her. The kitchen was already alive when she reached it, the cook and her assistants moving through the steam and wood smoke smell of early breakfast preparation. Rose took her usual place without being asked, carrying bread baskets and filling water pitchers, keeping her hands busy and her ears open. The other servants talked as they always did, in the loose, half-coded way of people who shared walls with the powerful and had learned to communicate in suggestion and implication. The beta's chambers were lit all night, said one of the younger maids, a girl called Petra, with red hair, and an uncontainable habit of noticing things. I saw the light under his door when I came down for the early water run. The signing ceremony has been delayed, said the cook flatly, without looking up from the bread dough she was working with the focused aggression she brought to all physical tasks. Steward came through an hour ago, told me to hold the formal breakfast until further notice. Petra's eyes went wide. Delayed? The clan delegations arrived yesterday. They can't just... Further notice means further notice, the cook said. Keep your voice down and your questions to yourself. Rose kept her head down and said nothing. She was carrying a stack of clean linen through the East Passage an hour later when she heard her name spoken in a voice she did not recognize. Rose of the household staff. She turned. The man standing in the passage was young, perhaps 25, with a lean, angular face and light eyes that held a quality of careful watchfulness she recognized immediately as military training. He wore Velmore's dark colors, but no beta's insignia, which meant he reported directly above Kale's rank, a king's man. The Alpha King requests your presence, he said. Now. Rose set down her linens neatly on the passage bench. Of course, she followed him through corridors she had never walked before. The upper reaches of the castle where the stone was older and the tapestries heavier, where the air smelled differently, like aged oak and cold iron and something faintly wild that she couldn't name. The king's man walked quickly and said nothing, and Rose matched his pace and kept her thoughts organized, which was the only preparation available to her. The room he brought her to was not the war room. It was smaller, more private. A study, she thought, judging by the shelves of bound documents along one wall and the single large desk positioned to catch the morning light from a narrow window. The view beyond the glass was the valley below Velmore, still gray-blue in the early morning, the distant tree line a dark smudge against the pale sky. Draven stood at that window. He turned when she entered, and she saw immediately that he had not slept either. It was not obvious. He held himself with the same contained authority as the night before. But she had spent 3 years reading subtle signs in tired faces, and she could see the particular flatness around his eyes that came from a night spent in motion rather than rest. He was not alone. A woman sat in a chair beside the desk, older, perhaps 50, with silver-streaked hair and the kind of posture that suggested she had spent decades refusing to apologize for taking up space. She wore a deep green robe edged in gray fur, and she was watching Rose with an expression of undisguised assessment, the way a craftsperson examined unfamiliar material. "This is Marin," Draven said. "She serves as the castle's record keeper and has held that position for 22 years. She was present at the signing session yesterday." Rose looked at Marin. Marin looked back at her with those sharp, evaluating eyes. "I pulled the original document from the archive seal last night," Draven continued. He moved to the desk and placed one hand on a document lying there, not picking it up, just resting his fingers on it. "The Westmark signature is present. The Stonefield line is not." Rose felt something shift in her chest, not quite relief, because the situation was clearly not resolved, but the particular steadiness that came from being confirmed rather than contradicted. "One signature, not two," she said carefully. "I may have miscounted." "One is sufficient," Draven said, and something in his voice told her that one missing signature had been more than enough to unravel something significant. Marin spoke for the first time. Her voice was measured and dry, like old parchment. The Stonefield delegation arrived with 7 representatives. By the time the signing occurred, only 5 were present. The other 2 had been redirected to a separate meeting with the Beta, ostensibly to discuss accommodation arrangements. She paused. "There are no accommodation arrangements that require 2 clan representatives and an hour of closed discussion." The room was quiet for a moment. Rose understood what she was hearing. Not just a missing signature. A missing signature that had been engineered to be missing, and then hidden behind a lie told to the Alpha King before the ink had even dried. "Why?" Rose asked, before she could stop herself. Both Draven and Marin looked at her. She almost apologized. Instead, she steadied herself. "Why would your Beta want the Stonefield clan excluded from the agreement? What does he gain from an incomplete border deal?" Marin's expression shifted slightly. Something that might have been approval, or might have been the recalibration of an initial assessment, Draven answered. "That is what I intend to find out." He looked at Rose directly, with that full-weight attention that still required conscious effort to withstand. "Cale has been informed that the ceremony is delayed pending a documentation review. He believes this is a routine administrative matter. He does not know you came to me last night." "Will he find out?" "Eventually." A pause. "Before that happens, I need to understand the full scope of what he has done, and I cannot do that if he is alerted. Which means your situation requires management." Rose absorbed this. "You need me to continue working as though nothing has changed." "Yes. While Cale potentially knows I overheard him last night. He knows you were in the corridor. He does not know what you heard or whether you acted on it. There is a difference." Draven moved away from the desk, coming to stand a few feet from her, closer than he had been the night before. Close enough that she was aware of the physical scale of him, in a way that was not threatening but simply undeniable. "I will not ask you to place yourself in danger. If at any point you believe he suspects you, you will come directly to me or to Marin. Is that understood?" "Yes, my king." "You will not be unprotected," he said. It was a simple statement, quiet, almost offhand. But something in the way he said it, the lack of ceremony around it, the absence of qualification, made it feel different from a political assurance. It felt like something closer to a fact. Rose nodded once. Marin rose from her chair with the unhurried efficiency of someone who had been managing difficult situations for 2 decades. "I will show you the secondary passage to the lower hall," she said to Rose, as though they were simply discussing linen routes. In case you require a discreet way to reach me. Rose followed her toward the door, and as she passed the desk, she caught a clearer look at the document lying there. The border agreement, the long column of names, and near the bottom, exactly where she had seen it the day before, a single empty line. She had been right. She had knocked on that door, and she had been right, and somehow that felt less like a comfort and more like the beginning of something she did not yet have a name for. Behind her, she heard Draven sit down at his desk. The sound of a document being lifted. The quiet, deliberate scratch of a quill beginning to move. The Alpha King was already working, and somewhere in this castle, his Beta was doing the same. The days that followed moved with a strange double rhythm. On the surface, Castle Velmore continued as it always had. The clatter of the kitchen at dawn, the measured footsteps of guards on their rotations, the formal meals in the great hall where lords and delegates sat at long tables beneath iron chandeliers and spoke of trade routes and harvest yields and the quality of the coming winter. Rose moved through all of it as she always had, carrying trays and collecting linens and keeping her eyes at the appropriate level, which was to say, low enough to seem invisible, high enough to see everything. Beneath the surface, something was pulling tight. She felt it in the way Cale watched the servants now. Not obviously, not in a way anyone else would notice, but with that particular quality of attention that meant he was cataloging, measuring. She had seen men like him before, men who kept careful internal ledgers of who knew what and when, who treated information as currency, and were always, quietly, counting. He had not spoken to her again since the night in the corridor. That silence was its own kind of pressure. On the third morning, Petra came to find her in the linen room with bright eyes and a lowered voice, and the particular energy of someone carrying news too large for their body. "They're saying the Stonefield delegation is still here," Petra whispered, glancing at the door. "They were supposed to leave 2 days ago. Something is holding them." "Delegations stay when negotiations are ongoing," Rose said, refolding a sheet with precise movements. "But the ceremony was supposed to be done. It's already done. Everyone said so." Petra leaned closer. "And I swear I heard this myself, Rose. From the corridor outside the East Chamber, I heard the Stonefield head representative arguing with someone. Loudly. In a way that men of that rank do not argue unless something has gone very wrong." Rose set down the sheet. "Who was he arguing with?" Petra hesitated, just a fraction of a second, but Rose caught it. "Petra." I couldn't see clearly. The door was nearly closed. A pause. But the voice on the other side was calm. Very calm. "You know how some people get quieter when they're angry instead of louder?" Rose knew exactly. "It could have been anyone," Petra finished, but her expression said clearly that she did not believe that. After Petra left, Rose stood alone in the linen room for a moment, her hands resting on the folded cloth, thinking. Then she picked up her basket and went about her morning. She did not go to Marin that day. She went the day after, using the secondary passage the record keeper had shown her. A narrow servants' corridor behind the east wing that connected, through a door disguised as a section of paneling, to the small archive room adjacent to Marin's office. The passage smelled of dust and cold stone, and the faint ghost of some herb she couldn't identify. Something dry and faintly bitter, like old medicine. Marin was already at her desk when Rose slipped through the panel, as though she had been expecting her, which she probably had. "Sit," Marin said, without looking up from the document she was reading. Rose sat in the plain wooden chair beside the desk and waited. After a moment, Marin set down her document and looked at her with those sharp, silver-framed eyes. "The Stonefield representative's name is Haddon," she said. "He is 63 years old, has led his clan delegation for 14 years, and has never in that time failed to complete a formal signing. He is not a man who forgets things or misses appointments." "He didn't miss the signing," Rose said slowly. "He was kept from it. Yes. Marin folded her hands on the desk. The question is what Cale offered his 2 representatives in that private meeting, and what he asked for in return. Have you found anything? Fragments. Marin's expression tightened slightly. Cale has been careful. He is always careful. But careful men still leave traces, because careful men still need to communicate, and communication always passes through someone. She paused. There is a courier. Young man, rides the eastern road 3 times a week. He carries messages between the castle and a holding in the lower valley, a property that does not appear in any official ledger connected to the beta's name, but which several servants can confirm he visits. Rose felt the shape of something beginning to form, still unclear at the edges but solid at the center. Someone is paying him, she said. Someone has been paying him for considerably longer than this border agreement has been in discussion, Marin replied, which suggests this is not opportunism. It is a plan. They sat with that for a moment. The archive room was very quiet. The only sound the occasional shift of the building around them, the deep structural settling of very old stone. Does Draven know? Rose asked. He knows what I have found, which is enough to confirm suspicion, but not enough to act on formally. Marin looked at her steadily. He is being careful too. An Alpha King who moves against his beta without sufficient evidence does not merely create an enemy, he creates a martyr. Rose understood. Power had its own geometry. The angles mattered as much as the force. What does he need? She asked. The courier, or the property, or the person on the other end of those messages. Marin tilted her head slightly. You move through this castle without being seen, Rose. You always have. That is not nothing. Rose looked at the older woman for a long moment. You're asking me to find something. I am telling you what is needed, Marin said carefully. What you choose to do with that information belongs entirely to you. It was a precise and deliberate distinction, and Rose recognized it for what it was. The record keeper protecting her, in the only way available within the particular constraints of her position. Marin could not order her, could not direct her, but she could illuminate the room and leave the door open. Rose nodded slowly and said nothing. She left through the panel passage and returned to her work. That afternoon, carrying afternoon refreshments to the east wing, she saw Cale for the first time since the corridor. He was walking toward her from the far end of the hall, alone, moving with that particular measured ease that was his default presentation to the world. He wore deep charcoal wool, a silver pin at his collar, his flint-colored eyes moving ahead of him the way a man's eyes moved when he was thinking about something other than where he was walking. He saw her when there were perhaps 20 feet between them, and he smiled. It was a small smile, brief, almost private, the smile of a man acknowledging a piece on a board rather than a person in a corridor. It contained no warmth. It contained instead something that made the back of Rose's neck tighten, with a clarity that she had learned, over a long life of reading rooms, to trust without question. He knew. Not everything. She was still standing, still employed, still walking this corridor without escort. So not everything. But something. He had been watching and measuring, and his ledger had produced a number that concerned him. And he was letting her see that he knew it. Because men like Cale believed that making their targets aware of their awareness was itself a form of control. Rose did not look away. She met his eyes for exactly the duration that a maid carrying a refreshment tray would meet a beta's eyes. Brief, respectful, impersonal. And then dropped her gaze and continued past him without breaking her stride. Her heart was hammering so loudly she was briefly certain he could hear it. She turned the corner, set the tray down on the nearest surface, and pressed both palms flat against the cold stone wall until her pulse slowed to something manageable. Then she straightened, picked up the tray, and kept walking. That evening, well after the castle had grown quiet, Rose sat in the narrow space behind the stable block where the stable hands took their breaks, on an upturned crate beside a low brazier that pushed out just enough warmth to make the cold bearable. She had come here under the pretense of delivering leftover bread from the kitchen, which was a real errand and therefore the best kind of cover. The young courier was eating alone at the far end of the bench, his horse already stabled for the night. Rose sat nearby and said nothing for a while. Then, in the easy, unguarded way of two people sharing warmth at the end of a long day, she said, "Long ride today?" The courier looked up, surprised by the company, then relaxed into it the way young people did when they were tired and lonely and someone spoke to them like they were simply a person. "Eastern Road and back," he said. "Hard ground. The frost is coming in early this year." "It always does in the valley," Rose said, and handed him a piece of the bread. He took it. She stayed for another few minutes, and by the time she left she had learned his name, the rough schedule of his rides, and, most importantly, the name he let slip without meaning to, the name of the holding he served on the Eastern Road. Edenmere. She had heard that name once before, in a context she hadn't connected until now. In the kitchen, 3 months ago, one of the older servants talking about a property dispute in the valley, about a lord who had lost territory to the border expansion 7 years earlier, the border expansion that had been the first act of Draven's reign. A lord who had never, according to the kitchen gossip, forgiven the new king for it. Rose walked back to the castle through the cold dark, the frost already gathering on the grass beneath her boots, and thought about how long a plan could be kept waiting before the person holding it could no longer afford patience. She thought Cale's patience was almost spent. She went to Marin before dawn. The archive room was cold at that hour, the small hearth unlit, the gray pre-morning light coming through the single high window in a way that made everything look like it had been drawn in charcoal. Rose sat in the plain wooden chair and told Marin everything. The courier, the name Edenmere, the lord who had lost territory in the first year of Draven's reign. She spoke quietly and without embellishment, the way she had learned to deliver information that needed to land clearly. Marin listened without interrupting. When Rose finished, the record keeper was quiet for a long moment, her silver-streaked hair loose at that early hour, her green robe pulled close against the chill. She looked older in this light, and also somehow more formidable, the way very old trees looked more substantial in winter, stripped of everything soft. "Lord Ferran of Edenmere," Marin said finally. "I know that name. I thought you might." He filed 3 formal objections to the border redrawing in the first year of Draven's rule. All 3 were reviewed and denied on legal grounds. The territory transfer was legitimate. Marin's jaw tightened slightly. He petitioned twice more in the following years through different channels. Also denied. "And then he stopped petitioning," Rose said. "Yes." Marin looked at her. "He stopped petitioning." They both understood what that meant. Men like Ferran did not simply accept defeat. They changed their methods. "If the Stonefield clan didn't sign," Rose said slowly, working it through as she spoke, "the border agreement is incomplete. It can be legally contested. If it's contested, the original territorial boundaries come back into question, including the ones established 7 years ago." "Including Edenmere," Marin confirmed. "Ferran gets his land back without ever having to win a battle. He simply has to ensure the current agreement collapses under its own weight." She paused. "And Cale provides the collapse." "What does Cale get?" Marin was quiet for a moment. Then, carefully, "Draven has no heir. He has no mate. The succession question has been present for several years now. If the king's judgment is publicly discredited, if he signs an invalid border agreement, if it fails, if the northern clans turn against Velmore, a beta who positions himself as the stable alternative becomes very valuable very quickly." The room felt colder. Rose had understood that something significant was at stake. She had not quite assembled the full shape of it until this moment, and now that she had, it sat in her chest with a particular heaviness. This was not a man angling for money or a favor. This was a man who had spent years building toward the removal of a king. "I need to bring this to Draven," Rose said. "You need to bring him Feyran," Marin corrected. "What you have now is a thread. A compelling thread, but a thread. Kale will deny everything and Feyran will deny everything, and without something more concrete." "The courier carries messages," Rose said. "Physical messages." Marin looked at her. "He rides 3 times a week. If the next ride carries something that connects Kale directly to Feyran, something written, something specific, that is not a thread." Rose met the older woman's eyes. "That is a rope." A long pause. The high window was beginning to lighten, gray shifting toward pale gold. "You would need to intercept it without alerting either of them," Marin said. "I know. If Kale learns what you are doing before you reach Draven." "I know that too." Marin studied her for a moment with those sharp, unhurried eyes. Then she stood, moved to the shelves behind her desk, and retrieved a small iron key from behind a row of bound ledgers. She set it on the desk in front of Rose without explanation. Rose looked at it. "What does this open?" "The gate in the eastern wall. The one the groundskeepers use." Marin sat back down. "It lets out onto the road that runs parallel to the eastern pass. If you needed to reach the road ahead of the courier, that would be the way to do it." She folded her hands. "I am telling you about a gate. Nothing more." Rose picked up the key. She had 1 day. The courier rode on a 3-day rotation, and he had ridden yesterday, which meant the next ride was 2 days away. But Rose had also heard him mention, in the easy, unguarded way of that fireside conversation, that the beta had requested an additional run this week. An extra ride, outside the usual schedule. That meant today or tomorrow. She did her morning work with the focused efficiency of someone who needed not to appear different from usual while being entirely different from usual. She carried linens. She swept the east passage. She delivered breakfast to the upper hall antechamber and collected the empty pitchers after. She smiled at Petra when Petra made a small joke about the steward's expression at morning orders, and the smile was genuine enough that Petra did not look at her twice. Kale passed her once, in the main corridor near midday. He did not smile this time. He simply looked at her, a single, flat, assessing look, and continued walking. Which was somehow worse than the smile had been, because the smile had contained performance, and this contained none. This was a man who had finished calculating and arrived at a conclusion. Rose finished her afternoon duties, ate in the kitchen with the other servants, and when the castle settled into its early evening rhythm, she slipped out through the groundskeeper's gate, with Marin's iron key and the cold of the coming night already sharp against her face. The eastern road was a pale strip in the fading light, running between frozen fields toward the dark line of the valley tree line. The air smelled of frost and turned earth and the distant resinous sharpness of pine. Her boots found the road and she moved quickly, keeping to the grass verge where her steps made no sound. Her shawl pulled tight and her breath coming in small white clouds. She had perhaps an hour of usable light. She found the courier 20 minutes down the road. He was not yet on his horse. He had stopped at the small stone waymarker where the eastern road forked, the place where travelers checked their bearings, and he was crouched beside his saddlebag with the focused attention of someone reorganizing its contents. His horse stood patient and steam-breathed beside him. Rose slowed her pace and thought fast. She could not simply take the messages. If they went missing, the alarm would be immediate. She needed to see them, to read them, and return them intact, which meant she needed time, and she needed him not to notice. She stepped off the road entirely, moving through the frozen grass to come around the far side of the waymarker, and crouched behind the stone structure. From here she could hear him clearly. The rustle of the bag, his quiet muttering as he sorted. She could also see, in the fading light, the shape of a sealed leather document pouch resting on top of the open bag. She waited. After a moment he stood, stretched, and walked a few paces away from the horse toward the field's edge. His back was to her. Rose moved. She was around the waymarker and at the saddlebag in 4 silent steps. Her fingers found the leather pouch, opened the seal with practiced care. She had spent 3 years handling sealed documents in castle service, and knew exactly the pressure required to open and reseal without obvious damage, and pulled out the folded paper inside. She had perhaps 30 seconds. She unfolded it and read. The handwriting was Cale's. She had seen it on duty rosters and staff directives enough times to recognize it. The letter was short, direct. 3 sentences that contained everything Marin had theorized and several things she hadn't. The king suspects nothing. The Stonefield matter is resolved as discussed. Be ready to move when I send word. The opportunity will not hold past the new moon. Below it, 4 words that turned Rose's blood cold. Deal with the maid. She refolded the letter, resealed the pouch, replaced it in the bag with hands that were steadier than they had any right to be. She was back behind the waymarker before the courier turned around. She crouched in the frozen grass with her heart slamming against her ribs and her mind working with the cold, rapid clarity that came when fear stopped being paralyzing and became instead fuel. Deal with the maid. He knew. Not just that she had overheard. He knew she had acted on it. He knew enough to consider her a problem requiring resolution. And the letter was moving toward Ferran tonight, which meant that whatever move was planned was close. Close enough that Cale was already tying off loose ends. She was a loose end. She waited until the courier mounted and rode, the sound of hoofbeats fading down the eastern road. Then she stood from behind the waymarker, turned, and began walking back toward the castle, not at the careful, invisible pace of a woman who belonged in these corridors, but fast, with the low, urgent stride of someone carrying information that had an expiration. The castle lights were gold against the darkening sky ahead of her. She needed to reach Draven, before the new moon, before Cale sent word, before the loose end was dealt with. She ran the last quarter mile. The service gate was cold beneath her fists when Rose pounded on it. The young guard recognized her face, and something in her expression made him step aside without asking questions. She was through the door and moving before he finished opening it, her boots leaving frozen mud across the flagstone floor, her breath still ragged from the last quarter mile. Draven was in the study. He rose from his desk the moment she entered, and she watched something shift in his face. A quick, controlled tightening as he took in the state of her. Wind-loosened hair, mud-darkened boots, the particular quality of stillness that came after running. Rose placed the letter on the desk in front of him without a word. He read it once, then again. The fire in the small hearth crackled softly, indifferent to everything. The silence that followed had weight and texture. It was the silence of something finally confirmed. Not a surprise exactly, but the particular heaviness of a suspicion becoming a fact, of a foundation crack becoming a fracture. Deal with the maid. He looked up at her. Are you hurt? The question caught her off guard. Not how did you get this, or are you certain? Just that. Direct and immediate. No, she said. He held her gaze for a moment, and then he moved. Draven acted before midnight, not with noise or spectacle, with the quiet, surgical precision of a man who had spent 7 years learning that power exercised correctly did not need to announce itself. He sent 3 of his most trusted men to intercept the courier on the eastern road before he reached Edenmere, retrieving the letter intact. He sent 2 others to quietly secure Lord Farron's holdings in the valley, sealing the property and its records before any word of trouble could arrive. Cale was brought to the war room at dawn. Rose was not present for that meeting. She did not need to be. She heard it later, from Marin, who had been present as official witness, her expression carrying the particular satisfaction of a woman who had kept careful records for 22 years and was watching the matter. Cale had denied everything for approximately 4 minutes. Then Draven placed the intercepted letter on the table beside the original border document with its missing Stonefield signature, alongside 3 years of courier records from the Eastern Road and a land deed connecting Ferran's property to a secondary account bearing Cale's mother's maiden name. The denial stopped. What followed was not a trial in the formal sense. It was a reckoning, conducted in a cold room at sunrise, with documents instead of swords. Cale had no defense that held against the accumulated weight of Marin's records and Rose's testimony. Lord Ferran, when his holdings were searched, was found to be in possession of correspondence that removed any remaining question of intent. Both men were removed from their positions before the morning meal. The Stonefield delegation, still resident in the castle, signed the border agreement that afternoon, this time with every representative present, every line completed, Haddon's signature firm and deliberate at the bottom of the page. The old clan leader said nothing about the delay, but he clasped Draven's arm at the conclusion with a grip that communicated clearly that he understood what had nearly happened and what had prevented it. 3 days later, Rose was carrying linens through the East Passage when Marin found her. The record keeper walked beside her in silence for a moment, which was unusual enough to be significant. "He wants to offer you a position," Marin said finally. "Not household staff. Something with more scope." Rose kept walking. "What kind of scope?" "The kind that involves knowing things and being trusted with them." A pause. "He believes you have a talent for both." Rose thought about the night she had stood in the corridor outside the war room, tray in hand, caught between 2 versions of herself, the one who stayed invisible and the one who knocked. She thought about what it had cost her and what it had produced, and whether those 2 things balanced. "I would need to know what the position actually entails," she said, naturally. Marin's tone carried the faint warmth of someone who had expected exactly that answer. "He thought you might say that. He said to tell you that the details are negotiable, but the offer is not temporary." Rose stopped walking. She stood in the corridor with the linen basket against her hip and looked at the familiar stone walls around her. Walls she had moved through invisibly for 3 years, keeping her eyes low and her thoughts to herself, and felt something shift in the architecture of her own life, quiet and irrevocable, like a door she had not known existed swinging open. The border agreement held. The northern territories settled into the new boundaries without conflict, the Stonefield clan among the first to establish formal trade relationships with Velmore. Lord Ferran's holdings were redistributed according to the original territorial law, and Edenmere passed quietly back into the Crown's oversight without a single battle fought. Cale left Velmore permanently, stripped of his rank and his insignia, and was not heard from again in any account that mattered. Marin added 3 new volumes to the castle archive that winter, documenting the full proceedings with her characteristic precision. She kept a personal copy of Rose's testimony in a separate folder, labeled simply, "The Maid Who Knew." Rose took the position. She sat across from Draven in the study on her first official morning, the frost still heavy on the valley below, the fire built properly for once, and he slid a document across the desk toward her. Not an order, but an outline, a beginning, something that required her response before it could become anything real. She read it carefully. Then she picked up a quill and began. Outside, the winter light came through the narrow window and fell across the desk between them, clean and honest and plain, illuminating everything it touched. It was enough. It was more than enough.